Richmond, Virginia, is a city steeped in history, where the old streets and buildings whisper tales of times gone by. But among the many legends that circulate through its cobblestone streets, one stands out as particularly sinister: the legend of the vampire of Richmond. This story, born from a railway disaster in the early 20th century, speaks of a creature that emerged from the rubble of a collapsed tunnel, fleeing to a nearby cemetery and disappearing into the darkness. Since then, reports of sightings and encounters with this enigmatic figure have haunted the residents and visitors of the city. Emily was a historian fascinated by urban legends. She had traveled across the country documenting stories and local mysteries, always in search of something deeper, something that challenged the thin line between reality and myth. When she heard about the vampire of Richmond, she knew she had to investigate. The Church Hill Tunnel, where the incident occurred, was still there, a silent monument to the disaster that claimed the lives of several railway workers. It was an autumn afternoon when Emily arrived in Richmond, the orange and golden leaves gently falling from the trees as she drove through the historic streets. She had done her research. The tunnel collapsed in 1925, killing several workers who were rebuilding it. But the real story, the one that captured her imagination, was of a strange figure seen emerging from the rubble, covered in blood, with pale skin and sharp teeth. The report said this figure fled to the nearby Hollywood cemetery and disappeared. Since then, it had been occasionally seen, always at night, always in the shadows, as if lurking, watching the living with hungry eyes. Some said it was a vampire, a being that had been awakened by the disaster and that now roamed the city, searching for blood. Emily arrived at the tunnel at dusk, as the shadows were already beginning to lengthen. The place had a sense of abandonment, of something forgotten by time. The tunnel walls were covered in graffiti, but it was still possible to see the marks of the collapse: loose stones, deep cracks, and an air of desolation that seemed to penetrate the bones. She walked along the tunnel entrance, trying to imagine what had happened there almost a century before. The air was cold, and there was an eerie silence around, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Emily took out her camera and began taking pictures, documenting the place as she did with all her projects. As she explored, Emily felt a presence. There was no other way to describe it. It was as if someone or something was there, in the shadows, watching her. She stopped, her heart beating faster, her senses on alert. She looked around, trying to identify any movement, any sound that might indicate the presence of another person. But the tunnel was empty. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Logic told her it was just her mind playing tricks on her, that the dark tunnel and the sinister story were feeding her imagination. But at the same time, she knew something was wrong. She decided to continue to the Hollywood cemetery, where the legend said the creature had fled. The cemetery, one of the oldest and most famous in the city, was surrounded by tall trees and covered by a soft mist that began to form as night fell. The ancient tombstones and imposing mausoleums were dark silhouettes against the darkening sky. Emily walked along the cemetery paths, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the damp ground. She felt the presence again, stronger now, as if she were being followed. She looked over her shoulder several times but never saw anything. The wind blew gently, carrying the smell of damp leaves and earth, and the silence was almost oppressive. Then she saw something that made her stop. A shadow moving quickly between the trees, a tall and slender figure that seemed to float above the ground. Emily's heart raced, and she instinctively raised her camera, capturing the silhouette before it disappeared into the darkness. Determined to discover more, Emily followed the direction in which the shadow had disappeared. She knew she was entering dangerous territory, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. She walked among the tombstones, feeling the air around her grow denser, colder. The cemetery seemed to be enveloped in an atmosphere from another time, as if time there moved differently. Finally, she reached an isolated area, where the mausoleums were older, their iron doors rusted and the walls covered in moss. It was there that she saw a figure crouched beside a tombstone, broad shoulders hunched, head tilted as if absorbed in some macabre act. Emily stopped, barely breathing, as she tried to understand what she was seeing. The figure slowly rose, its silhouette standing out against the faint moonlight. When it turned toward her, Emily felt a chill run through her body. The figure's eyes glowed in the dark, reflecting the light like those of a nocturnal predator, and she saw, with growing terror, that the creature's mouth was stained with something dark, something that could only be blood. The vampire of Richmond stood before her, a living legend, a figure that defied everything she knew to be possible. Emily knew she should run, that she should leave that place as quickly as possible. But her feet seemed glued to the ground, her mind torn between horror and fascination. The creature took a step toward her, its movements smooth and almost hypnotic. Emily finally forced herself to move, slowly backing away, trying to stay calm. But when the creature advanced faster, she could no longer contain her panic. She turned and ran, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the deserted cemetery. She ran through the tombstones, trying not to look back, trying to ignore the sound of the creature getting closer. Fear drove her on, and she knew her only chance was to reach the cemetery gate. The cold air cut through her lungs, and her legs ached, but she kept running, feeling despair set in. Finally, she saw the iron gate of the cemetery, and with one last effort, she ran toward it, pushing it open with force and throwing herself to the other side. The gate slammed shut behind her with a clang, and Emily fell to her knees, gasping, feeling relief mixed with a deep terror. She looked back at the now silent cemetery, shrouded in shadows. The creature hadn't followed her, but she knew it was there, hidden among the trees and tombstones, waiting for another reckless soul to dare to enter its domain. Emily knew she would never forget that night, that the vision of the vampire of Richmond would stay with her forever. She left the cemetery, still trembling, but with the conviction that she had discovered something real, something that defies logic and reason. She knew she needed to tell this story, but she also knew that few would believe her. And you, would you believe it? What would you do if you came face to face with a living legend? Stay with us, because the world is full of mysteries that defy understanding, and each story takes us deeper into the darkness. There is much more waiting to be discovered, and each legend has its dark truth.